As we found out in the previous video, corruption not only existed in the USSR, but was also thriving. Almost all Soviet citizens encountered it from a young age. For example, getting a last-minute voucher for a child to go to the seaside, or moving up in the queue to get an apartment, or just to get any scarce goods like a TV or a tape recorder. The very nature of the Soviet system inevitably gave rise to corruption and lawlessness. Today we will continue to study the most high-profile corruption cases in the USSR. Let's look at 3 more landmark trials that clearly demonstrated the rottenness of the Soviet system, so beloved by many. They showed how members of the Communist Party lined their own pockets and bathed in luxury unimaginable for the average person. At the same time, they told everyone that people should live modestly and obediently. As always, Semyon here. This is the Mega Show TV channel. Once again, we're diving into the world of shortages and theft of socialist property. Let's begin. Shchyolokov and the police clique. This story is not a single case, but a whole cascade of cases connected with the Minister of Internal Affairs of the USSR, Nikolai Shchyolokov. He was one of Brezhnev's best friends since the war. Later on, the future General Secretary promoted his protege everywhere. After leading the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Shchyolokov became one of the most powerful people in the Union. And he entered into a rivalry with another security official, KGB chief Andropov. It should be noted that under Shchyolokov, the police, especially its top ranks, became mired in corruption, abuse, and nepotism. Not without the direct complicity of their immediate superior, of course. For example, the first Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs was none other than Yuri Cherbanov, Brezhnev's son-in-law. All it took was marrying Galina Brezhneva, and just like that, he went from colonel to colonel general, and a saying appeared among the people: "Don't dream of herding sheep, just get married like Cherbanov." The famous case of the murder on Zhdanovskaya also testifies to the Soviet police being rotten from the inside. In December 1980, drunken officers from the line department of the police at Zhdanovskaya metro station beat a KGB officer to death in order to take his food ration. At that time, it was unthinkable to raise a hand against a KGB officer, and murder crossed all the red lines. Andropov did not forgive this, and he initiated such a large-scale investigation that it uncovered widespread abuse of power by officers from various police departments in Moscow, involving injuries, robberies, and murders. More than 300 officers were dismissed, and those directly involved in the murder were convicted and executed by firing squad. The final blow was dealt after Brezhnev's death. After taking the post of General Secretary, Andropov removed Shchyolokov. A special investigation into the former minister's activities revealed a significant number of instances of abuse and involvement in corruption. During the search of Shchyolokov's property, antiques, jewelry, numerous paintings, and expensive cars were found. The total damage to the state was estimated at 500,000 rubles. He was stripped of all military ranks, state awards, and expelled from the party. Unable to withstand such pressure, Shchyolokov shot himself. As for Cherbanov, he was sentenced to 12 years with confiscation of property, of which he served only 6. And Galina Brezhneva was sent for compulsory treatment for alcohol addiction. She spent the last years of her life in a psychiatric hospital. The Volgograd case. This case was also directly related to corruption within the Ministry of Internal Affairs system. Therefore, it can be considered a kind of offshoot of the Shchyolokov case. And moreover, in fact, this case became a reality. It was the first high-profile case related to systematic protection by the valiant Soviet police and theft amounting to millions of rubles. Not for free, of course. From the previous videos, you already understood that it was impossible to work in Soviet trade without corruption. This was facilitated by constant shortages, the planned nature of the economy, plain human greed, and even the phenomenally low salaries of trade workers, 90 to 95 rubles a month. And Volgograd was no exception. As for Volgograd itself, which by the way used to be called Stalingrad, the city's most important enterprises were the meat processing plant, the liquor and vodka factory, the dairy plant, and the confectionery factory. But here's the problem. Starting from the mid-1970s, it was simply impossible to find the products of these enterprises openly for sale in this very city. However, even basic necessities also started to disappear from store shelves. Moreover, it became difficult to buy the coveted small bottle or half a liter, which was nonsense even for the Soviet system. But on the black market there was abundance. Take as much as you want. You just had to pay a little extra. On average, 3 to 4 times more than the official price. All this artificially created shortage, and the cunning schemes for selling stolen goods were covered up for 17 years by the head of the Volgograd Regional Department of Internal Affairs, Police Major General Konstantin Ivanov, who was awarded 5 orders, and numerous medals, honorary badges, and departmental awards. Over the years of his valiant service, he created a reliable system that guaranteed favorable treatment from the police for those who embezzled socialist property. And in return, he received a continuous flow of money, valuables, and scarce goods. A whole chain was created that worked like clockwork, precisely and reliably. Hundreds of people were involved in it. Police chiefs, enterprise managers, and workshop supervisors. Heads of the security service, directors of wholesale warehouses, and of course, representatives of the party leadership. Reports that a full-fledged food mafia had formed in Volgograd began to come in as early as the early 1980s. Reports were sent to all Moscow authorities that products were not only being taken illegally from enterprises, but also hauled away by truckloads. However, thanks to the connivance of Minister Shchyolokov, all complaints were sent back down to Volgograd, landing on the desk of the local mob boss. And if the letter wasn't immediately thrown in the trash, General Ivanov's response was always the same: the facts were not confirmed. But under Andropov, they started to take the matter more seriously, and they continued even after the General Secretary's death. After all, the Volgograd case clearly demonstrated how deeply corruption had penetrated the law enforcement agencies that were supposed to fight it. It was precisely because of such Soviet gangsters that scarce goods massively disappeared from official circulation and were resold on the black market at inflated prices. And then many high-ranking officials were surprised. How is it that we are the richest country, but we can't catch up with America? The arrests began in 1985, and the Volgograd Don Corleone himself was caught by the KGB the following year. At the same time, they were afraid to keep Ivanov and his henchmen in the local detention center, fearing that the local bribed prison guards would arrange an escape. As a result, they were secretly transported to Moscow on a special flight, where they were placed in solitary cells. In total, more than 300 people stood trial in the Volgograd case. General Ivanov and his accomplices from the police department each received a well-deserved 10 years in a high-security prison. And Volgograd turned from a symbol of heroic past into a symbol of abuse and corruption among law enforcement agencies. And in fact, it gave rise to a new concept in Soviet justice: organized crime. The Cotton Case. Now, this case is probably the most famous of all Soviet trials related to corruption. And this is primarily because it took place during the Gorbachev years, a time of glasnost and relative democracy. And while previous cases were strictly classified, the Cotton or Uzbek case was actually discussed in the mass media at the end of the 1980s. But it all began, as you correctly guessed, back in the Brezhnev years. At that time, Uzbekistan was ruled by the first secretary Sharaf Rashidov, a kind of petty czar over the whole republic, or rather, a sultan. And there were quite a few such sultans throughout the entire union. After the USSR collapsed, some became the first presidents of independent states. For instance, Niyazov, first secretary of the Communist Party of Turkmenistan, became Turkmenistan's president. First secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev became president of Kazakhstan. However, let's go back to Uzbekistan, or more precisely to the problem of cotton. For the modern viewer, who often wears clothes made of synthetic fabrics, this is not a problem at all. But 50 years ago, cotton fabrics were the most in demand in the USSR, and they were made from a special plant called the cotton plant. And it was grown, as you correctly guessed, specifically in Uzbekistan. The importance of cotton was so great that it was officially called white gold, on par with black gold, which is oil. In short, by the early 1970s, the demand for cotton fabrics among Soviet people had increased significantly, to the point where there was even talk of purchasing the necessary raw materials from abroad, first and foremost in India and Pakistan. But then the already mentioned Rashidov stepped onto the stage and declared, "There's no need for anything from abroad. We'll grow everything ourselves. Here in Uzbekistan, just give us more funds from the union budget to develop cotton growing. Let Moscow, they say, help out with some money and we'll take care of the rest." Brezhnev gave the green light, and a golden rain poured down on Uzbekistan, but the lion's share of the funds was stolen. At the same time, all suitable arable land was given over to cotton growing. This severely depleted the soil, and the use of cheap toxic fertilizers and pesticides led to an environmental disaster. In particular, it caused the rapid shrinking of the Aral Sea. Moreover, instead of the praised agricultural machinery, manual labor was mainly used in the fields. For example, the chairman of the Lenin collective farm, Akhmadjo Nadilov from the Fergana region, basically turned his subordinates into slaves. Their salaries were minimal. They worked 12 to 14 hours a day, and the demands on them increased day by day. For failing to meet the plan, they were whipped or locked up in a grain elevator that had been turned into a prison. The local authorities and police knew about this medieval lawlessness, but turned a blind eye to everything. But the plan still had to be fulfilled somehow. But just look at the result. On paper, the cotton harvests increased year after year. Rashidov triumphantly reported to Moscow, "Everything is great here. The plans are being met and exceeded. Just give us more money." They allocated the money, but here the principle of a vicious circle kicked in. "Okay, since you're doing well, let's raise the production quotas." Inspired by such labor victories, the USSR State Planning Committee kept demanding more and more. Rashidov was given increasingly unrealistic plans, and he always saluted and agreed, as if to say, "Always ready," like a young pioneer. If not, the golden rain would stop, and he could be forced into retirement or worse. It's a clear vicious circle. So in the cotton affair, an important role was played not only by the greed of Uzbek top managers and their patrons in Moscow, but also by the very planned model of the Soviet economy itself. When tasks came down from above that were impossible to fulfill, every lower-ranking official still tried to sell nonsense to their superiors and report on their successes. And of course to pocket something for a rainy day. And as Soviet citizens later joked, the plan is being fulfilled, but there's nothing to buy. Andropov was informed as early as the late 1970s that there was something fishy about the record cotton harvests. Signals that textile factories were experiencing an acute shortage of raw materials and that hospitals lacked even such a cheap material as cotton wool, which by the way is made from cotton, could not go unnoticed by the all-seeing KGB. But as long as Brezhnev was alive, Rashidov managed to get away with it and even receive new funding. So, what was further established was that, for example, from 1979 to 1982, Rashidov received 4 billion rubles for cotton that was never actually delivered. The situation changed dramatically in 1983. And the cotton case started in a banal way, because of an attempt to bribe an honest man who refused to sign the acceptance certificate, in which empty wagons meant for cotton suddenly became full, and he reported it to the authorities. And then everything started. The case began to unravel. Output figures inflated by millions, double bookkeeping, and a multi-level pyramid of lies, theft, and bribery came to light. And calls from Moscow to Tashkent on the government line became more and more frequent. Rashidov understood that the situation was no longer just smoldering, it was already blazing. On October 31, 1983, Rashidov suddenly died. Officially, it was from a heart attack. But malicious tongues claimed that the uncrowned Sultan of Uzbekistan, according to Uzbek journalists, had taken his own life, fearing inevitable retribution from Andropov. But his death did not stop the whole process at all. On the contrary, it even accelerated it. After realizing their boss was dead and no one would protect them, many who had embezzled became more willing to cooperate with the investigation. Moreover, Rashidov's successor, Usman Kadjayev, who openly criticized his former boss, was also accused of corruption. The cotton case was pushed so far that not even the death of Andropov himself, nor the death of his successor Chernenko could stop it. The investigation continued under Gorbachev as well. The climax of the process came in 1987-1988, when reports about those arrested and convicted were coming on every TV screen and in every newspaper, just like frontline reports. And ordinary citizens of the USSR, perhaps for the first time, began to realize just how corrupt the country they were forced to live in was. If, of course, you can even call that living. As for punishments, they were also marked by exemplary cruelty. Apparently, it was to clearly show the serfs that the good Tsar would always punish the especially greedy boyars. The Uzbek minister of the cotton industry, Usmanov, and the head of the Department of Economic Crimes, Muzaffarov, were sentenced to execution by shooting. More than 36 high-ranking Uzbek officials were sentenced to long prison terms. Another 4,000 received less than 10 years. The Central Committee of the Uzbek Communist Party was almost completely renewed, which allowed many mid-level party officials to make a dizzying career. For example, the future first president of independent Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov. Let's draw conclusions. Thus, corruption in the country of universal equality and prosperity was caused by a number of systemic factors rooted in the peculiarities of the economic, political, and social organization of the USSR. The scarcity of goods and services created fertile ground for bribery in order to gain access to scarce products or privileges. And informal connections became a way to solve problems, which in fact legitimized corrupt practices. At the same time, centralization and the lack of real oversight over the actions of party officials inevitably led to the use of official positions for personal gain. Overall, corruption in the USSR was not just an individual moral problem, but a systemic phenomenon generated by the very structure of the Soviet state. It undermined the people's trust in the authorities and became one of the deep-rooted reasons for the collapse of the great and powerful Soviet system. Well, that's all from me. See you in the next episode.